7, West Claremont High School. I'm Mr. Grippa, your anatomy teacher, and this is going to be bone tray quiz number 4 review over the skull. The skull gives us a unique situation where we're not only looking at bones and processes, but we also have a lot of foramina, holes, openings, and a lot of the sutures, the immovable joints here are on the skull. So let's go ahead and get started. So first we'll go over the bones in the skull. We have here in the front or the forehead the very creatively named frontal bone. The paired bones on the side here are the parietal bones, and the big bone in the back is the occipital bone. We'll move to the bones here in the face. We have the cheekbone here is the zygomatic bone. The bone here on the side that we typically refer to as our temple is the temporal bone. The bone that holds our upper teeth here in the front of the face is the maxilla. Let's go to the bones here around the eye socket or orbit. We have this small bone here in the very corner of the eye, the medial corner of the eye, is called the lacrimal bone, and it contains the lacrimal apparatus for draining tears. If we go behind that bone and work medially in the orbit, we have the ethmoid bone, and then at the very back of the socket of the orbit, we have the sphenoid bone. And then behind and then you can also see the sphenoid here, behind the eye socket here, right in front of the temporal and the piece of the zygomatic bone. So the sphenoid would be right here. Other bones we have here at the bridge of the nose, that is the nasal bone, the paired bones right there. Inside the nose cavity we have the vomer, and then down at the bottom we have the inferior nasal concha. The other bone that we have in the skull is the very posterior section of the hard palate, and that's called the palatine bone back here. So up here at the front of the mouth is still the maxilla, but back here towards the posterior of the roof of the mouth is the palatine bone. And then of course finally we have the mandible, commonly referred to as the jawbone, but here in anatomy class we call it the mandible. All right, so let's move on to the sutures that you have on the quiz. The suture that comes across the front here, separating the frontal from the parietal bones, is called the coronal suture. The suture that goes right down the middle, here across the top, would divide the body into right and left portions, is called the sagittal suture. You may remember that term from Unit 1 when we did the planes in the body. And then this suture here, separating parietal and occipital bones, would be the lambdoid suture. Over here on the side, separating the temporal bone from the parietal, is called the squamosal suture or squamous suture. And the two extra little sutures that we have here in the nose, we have the suture going right down the middle that divides the two nasal bones. That is the internasal suture, which would be intermediate between the two nasal bones. And then the suture coming across the bridge of the nose that divides the frontal from the nasal bones would be the frontonasal suture. Okay? Next, we'll go to the processes. So the first set of processes are a little tricky due to where they are on the skull. But this section of the skull right here is called the zygomatic arch, and it actually has pieces of two bones making this complete arch. So you have the zygomatic bone that articulates with the temporal bone. So this process of the temporal bone that touches the zygomatic bone is known as the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. And then the reverse of that is what we find here at the end of the zygomatic bone that articulates with the temporal bone. So this is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. And you can see the suture right through here. I'm not holding you responsible for that, but you can see the suture that separates the two. So the zygomatic process of the temporal bone and the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. Other processes that we have are underneath. We have the two articular surfaces here at the bottom of the skull. So this is where your skull articulates with atlas, the C1 vertebrae, and those are called the occipital condyles. The large blunt processes over here are both of the mastoid processes, and the two very skinny pointy processes here would be the styloid processes right there. Next, we will discuss the holes and openings. So we'll start with the big one. This large hole here in the bottom of the skull here is called the foramen magnum, and it is the hole for your spinal cord. Right in front, there are two large holes right here that are kind of in between, or about at the bottom edge of this occipital bone. Those are the jugular foramen right here, and they're the holes for your jugular vein. And right in front of those, on this plastic skull, they're actually not openings, they're little depressions in here, but in a real skull they would be an opening through the bone, and that would be the carotid foramen, and that's the hole for the carotid artery. Other openings, we have this hole right here at my finger where your ear would be. Again, on this plastic skull is not a total hole or opening, it's just a depression. But in a real skull you would see a tube or a tube-like passageway here, and we should remember that any tube-like passageway is a meatus, and this is the external auditory meatus, which is the opening for your ear canal. The other openings that we have two small holes here on the brow ridge above the orbit, and they're referred to as the supraorbital foramen. The other two are, or supra for superior or above. The other two are directly below or inferior to the orbits, and we call those the infraorbital foramen. Again, infra indicating inferior or below the orbits. And the other openings we have is the paired holes here in the chin, and we call these the mental foramen or foramina. And I always tell people that when you think about something and you're being very mental, you do this, and you touch your mental foramen. All right, so thanks for tuning in. That's all for Quiz 4 on the skull, and we'll see you next time.